Hey folks, how's it going? Dr. Spin, good to see you. I've got the second half of my Father's Day, post-Father's Day roundup set up for you guys today. Got into 6 albums. This is stuff I've been listening to maybe for a week or so. Nothing more than impressions at this point. But things that I think at this point in time, maybe some of the strongest listening I've run across this year. I'm real excited about some of the songs on this roundup. So let's go ahead and get started with it. First one is this album by The Flaming Lips, their new album, The King's Mouth. I've been a fan of The Flaming Lips since the Soft Bulletin back in 2000. And a very ardent fan, actually, after I saw them play a live show in Denton when they were doing the tour for Embryonic, which is a great, amazing live show. It's worthy of its own posting, I believe. But the Flaming Lips have kind of, in recent years, gotten to the point where they've kind of jumped the shark a little bit. Their last album, Oxley Melody, gave me the sense that they were kind of just being weird for the sake of being weird. And it had a lack of focus to it that I just really couldn't get around. So I kind of was, the Flaming Lips have been kind of involved in these sort of side projects that I felt like was kind of bleeding some of the creativity a little bit. And so I felt like it was starting to have an effect on their more canonical Flaming Lips releases. But I'm happy to say that The King's Mouth really feels like a return to form for them in many ways.
How many times is it gonna take? How many times is it gonna take?
King's Mouth comes across like kind of like a concept album. It's a little bit of almost a rock opera, really. It has a storyline that goes along with it. It's narrated by ex-Clash member Mick Jones, and it's a story about this gigantic baby who's a prince and grows up to be a huge king, and all these things happen to him. And amazingly, the Flaming Lips are able to take this very kind of psychedelic and bizarre story and weave a lot of sort of weave it broadly enough with broad enough strokes that there's a lot of really beautiful observations on the human condition that come up during the course of them telling this story. And that's when the Flaming Lips are at their best, when they're being kind of psychedelic and surreal, but at the same time are really able to make an amazing, some touching music that really speaks to something about being human that you couldn't get at it in a very direct fashion. So I'm a big fan of Flaming Lips, and I really suggest the King's Mouth if you are a fan, and especially if you think that maybe they've been relatively unfocused in recent years. I think that the King's Mouth, this album, using the narrative that they did on the album, has forced them to be a little more focused than they have been in the past. So King's Mouth, that's a thumbs up for me. Second album I'm looking at is this album called Astronoid, and it's self-titled, Astronoid's Astronoid. Astronoid, their previous album, Air, it was 2 years ago, was like runner-up for Album of the Year. Really love that album, and I put a review about on this earlier this year with the understanding that I'd probably get into this album later on this year. That time came. And the big sort of trepidation that I had about this album and that I put forth in that review is I was afraid they weren't going to be able to kind of strike that really magical balance that they had on their previous album between the kind of really heavy underpinnings of their music, the kind of the thrash part of their music, and the sort of more pop, ethereal, angelic, Mew-inspired aspects of their sound. That's what Astronoid is. It's like you take the thrash metal and dream pop and you put them together, and that's what they did. And they've really struck that balance extremely beautifully and on their previous album. Now, the bad news is I don't think they quite struck the balance as well on Astronoid as they did in their first album. Okay? They dialed back some of their thrash elements to a degree, so it's a little bit less heavy. And what that ends up making it sound like, and it kind of makes the Mew aspects come to the fore a little bit more. So really, it just kind of sounds like heavy Mew at sometimes. And the good news is that's not terrible, because Mew is a brilliant band, and Bolan and the guys from Astronoid have enough respect and deference for what Mew has done in their best moments, that they're still able to capture that they still capture a metal version of Mew, but just not like a thrash metal version of Mew is sort of my take on it. And I also have to admit that sometimes I feel like some of the melodic parts of their on Astronoid are a little bit recycled. It feels like it refers back to what happened on the first album. So, but again, that's not terrible. Taking it in of itself, without a reference to the first album, the album is quite good. Astronoid is quite good on its own. But I would suggest Air over this one. I think Air is quite masterful, and this is really, Astronoid is very good. It just doesn't quite feel as inspired as the previous album. Next one up is a album by a band called Ulver, The Assassination of Julius Caesar. Now, I discovered Ulver a couple of years ago. They're a kind of a very mercurial group. Had their beginnings in sort of thrash metal and evolved into sort of like this, through lots of different permutations apparently. But the only album I ever had by Ulver was their previous album, this one called The War of the Roses. And I got that album and I was never really particularly enamored of it, but it was okay. But I heard so many really great things about this album. People who like Ulver really love Ulver. And so there's so much positive praise for this band out there that I got really curious about this album because of the take that many reviewers, many critics have had on the album. They sort of throw away their more avant-garde underpinnings and try to sort of delve into sort of kind of 80s dark, eerie pop, synth pop music. They view this, if you read interviews with Ulver, they see this as their pop album. Now, it has some very cacophonous and strident moments on it. By any other standard, I wouldn't really call it a pop album, but by Ulver standards, it's very accessible. Has a very interesting lyric approach where they kind of take parallels between current day events and relate them to kind of more historical events. And musically, the band is very solid. There's a lot of very great production things going on with the album. But the thing about it that kind of sets me off is the vocalist. Now, has nothing to do with the vocalist's performance. He sings extremely well. He's got a very full-bodied and rich voice. But this is the same problem I have with War of the Roses. I feel like his sense of melody is a little bit cliched, maybe even anemic sometimes. It just feels like he's sort of going to very easy and available melodic material to render the lyrics. It gives me the sense that the lyrics came first to the album, and then he put melody along with the lyrics later, which isn't a bad comment, not a bad way to come at it, but sometimes it lends itself to less interesting melodies, and that's kind of what I feel like happens some on this album.
Too hard to believe.
I don't think that Ulver's lyrics or music is particularly corny, but I don't know if I can get behind the way that the melodies are structured. I'm still kind of digesting it, deciding if that's really how I feel about it. This is one of the albums of these I've kind of listened to the least, so I'm still on a very first impression basis with it. But that's sort of my first kind of hot take on the album. We'll see in the long run if that pans out. Okay, next up is this album I'm kind of excited about. It's called The Bombay Royale. This is the name of the band. It's the Bombay Royale. And the album is called You, Me, Bullets, Love. Now, this band has a great concept. Here's what they do. They try to make theoretical movie soundtracks for a genre of movie that, to my knowledge, has never existed. Bollywood spy films. Spy films made in Bollywood. I don't think that ever really happened, and if anybody wants to prove me wrong, please do. All the trappings of James Bond films and those sort of spy films, but sort of put through the filter of what it might sound like in a Bollywood setting, because Bollywood has its own set of trappings and distinct characteristics that they get at. Allowing them to spread their net that wide allows them to really pull in a broad variety of influences. It's very, very fascinating. I mean, you could put the surf guitar that was so popular in the 60s and kind of funk horn sections that you would hear in the 70s with, more 70s inspired spy music of James Bond movies, and put it right alongside things like, tabla and sitar and Indian solfege names, essentially, and all the rhythmic tricks that you can do in Indian music. You see these things show up. It's really fascinating, a lot of fun. It's kind of like if you took Caeser the Turkish musician that I reviewed a couple of years ago, and the Budos band, and kind of found a way to get them to meld together. That's the sense that you get from the Bombay Royale. And they're an Australian band. This is the other thing about it. They're not actually from India. I mean, I think that there are people in the band that clearly have ties to that heritage and at least have some pretty amazing expertise in that style of music. So it's interesting to hear this very interesting mix of music and location that goes on with the Bombay Royale that really makes it a pretty unique approach. And I enjoy listening to this. It's a lot of fun to listen to for sure. So Bombay Royale. Okay, the next one up is just to flip sides on this one a little bit. Is this album by someone who is a colleague of mine during my graduate degree, has gone on to be a PhD professor up in New York State. This is Julia Licata and her recording Unsound Resound. Unsound Resound is the product of a grant proposal that Julie was trying to put together with where she would take percussion, she would process it through a variety of analog effects and create kind of new sounds and new textures. And the end product was going to be this album. The album, interestingly, is set up in 2 tracks, each one roughly 15 minutes long. And the reasoning for that is it was intended to be released on vinyl, 2 sides. The first one, Resound, is a treatment of xylophone music, and it's put through this process called time lag accumulation. And it goes through a series of tape loops that go back and around each other. The process is well established and has been used actually by composers before. It was created, Steve Reich has used it before, created in the late 60s. So Julie had taken the xylophone and put it through this process in the course of creating this first composition, Resound. And I really enjoy this first track a lot. Resound has, for me, if I listen to it as a piece of ambient style music, it reminds me a lot of early Tangerine Dream music, but like Zeit, And if I listen to Zeit, I've always likened listening to Zeit sort of like trying to listen to water boil right at the edge of the boiling point. There's this kind of tension that goes on with that album. In some ways, Resound is like that, but I also think that Resound has a little bit more of an exploratory nature to it. It feels like, a constant discovery of what's going to be happening next. flip side is starkly different. Unsound is a treatment of a bass drum and a gong that are put through a series of kind of feedback loops, basically. And where resound sort of builds up from a kind of what sounds like a hum, unsound starts with almost like a foghorn sound and builds to this huge wall of sound, of feedback. And over the course of the 15 minutes of the track, she's kind of like trying to pinch off harmonics and find different ways to tease out new sounds from these instruments as this kind of feedback loop is going on. If I'm going to listen to the first track like Tangerine Dream, I'm going to listen to this one like a zone, like a drone metal album, like something that Sun would put out. It's like she created this big wall of sound. She's almost like trying to hold it back the whole time for a good 10 minutes, just trying to find ways to bring it under control. And that's, if you look at it from that perspective, the recording is very fascinating. But you have to understand that's the kind of listening you're going to have to find the beauty in that second track, in the Unsound track. Okay, last one I have for you guys. This is one I'm most excited about. This is the new album by Black MIDI. Black MIDI's Schlagenheim. Now, these guys have kind of gotten a lot of hype in indie circles, and people consistently are talking about, well, they're overrated, or people don't get them, or they just don't like it. First of all, I don't think they're overrated. I think they're great, but I gotta frame that within the fact that I was a huge math rock fan about 10 years ago. I liked Don Caballero. I was a big fan of Rumah, Sakit, one of my favorite math rock bands. Light is another one. And so from the very beginning of this album, they present themselves as kind of like a math rock band. Weird time signatures, kind of noisy, almost like a punk rock standoffishness with the audience. But they also temper that with some other things. One of the things that math rock never did particularly well was they never found a voice. Math rock was mostly instrumental, historically speaking, until Battles came along. And Battles kind of took a take on math rock that took it to another place. Most of the time, with Battles accepted, math rock bands was just, if there was any vocals, it was just kind of sung by whichever guitarist could hold the tune the best. Very rarely was there much attention paid to the vocal part of it. Generally speaking, there's always exceptions, right? Farrakhan was a kind of a math rock band, and they had some vocals that were quite good. But Black MIDI takes a whole different approach. They give the style a voice that befits its quirky nature.
She looks so distraught as all her efforts amount to nothing. I sit back and watch her 69 mind in full effect. Every crowd just hits itself with a different perspective, and she recycles points with different account of voice.
Now, you can say what you want to about Georgia Greep's vocal style there, but I think it takes a great deal of vision and courage, really, to get up and sing in that style. It's a choice, okay? He's singing in a style that sort of has Les Claypool's quirkiness and some of Jeff Buckley's charisma and expressiveness. But then he bridges that gap by kind of adopting this David Byrne with an Italian accent persona. And he uses that throughout the album. It's pretty amazing. And it's a tribute to he and his bandmates that they're able to make that happen. And, speaking of his bandmates, you can't have a math rock band without having a killer drummer. It's like having a blues band and not having a great guitar player in the front. And the drummer, Morgan Simpson, is tearing it up all over that album. I mean, you see in that clip there, he's got the chops to play with time in a way almost like Bill Bruford would, but with the energy and aggressiveness that comes from like a Mars Volta drummer almost. It's phenomenal. And again, these guys are all barely 20 years old. They're just out of high school. So the future is really bright for them. I don't think they're quite there yet. They're not like the next big thing, the next thing that's going to save like experimental rock music quite yet. But it's there. You can see it in the future. The album itself has some amazing music in it. A couple, 3 or 4 tentpole songs that really are adventurous beyond the band's years. And there's also some other songs in there that are still, I mean, they're still good. Their creativity isn't quite as distinct as songs like, say, Western. That song is an amazing piece of work. And if they can follow that train, follow that lead, like on songs like Western, that song that from clip was Ductor, they're going to have a big impact, I think, if they keep going in the way they're going. So Black MIDI Schlagenheim, I would definitely check it out and keep their eye on them, because I think that they got some stuff that in the future is really going to come to fruition. That's all I got for you guys this week. It's my last round of the summer. Summer's closing up, come up to the close. A lot of people are still got a little bit of time left, but I don't. But I'll still be here. Hopefully next week with another album of the week. And until then, I'll catch you guys on the flip side.